Okay, so I'll talk about fiscal policy and learning, and this is joint work with George Evans and Sepp Foya. So monetary policy is, kind of usually considered as a quite useful tool in fighting inflation and unemployment, and it has been with the great moderation for more than 2 decades or so. And the advent of inflation targeting was a pretty useful. It was considered quite a useful tool in this in maintaining low inflation and stable growth for a long time. And you might also say that depending on, it may or may not have contributed to the housing boom and bust just before during the first half and the second thereafter of the past decade, depending on whether listen to Bernanke or Ben Bernanke or John Taylor. But generally it is considered that there have been policy measures have been quite aggressive since at least the onset of the subprime crisis in August 2007, or subsequently in September 2008 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the severity of the financial crisis. So, however, even with the type of measures adopted, which including quantitative kind of different kinds of conventional and unconventional measures, it may have prevented another Great Depression, but perhaps not a Great Recession of what is typically called the recent kind of recession which has happened. So naturally, interest has shifted to fiscal policy measures. The other kind of policy tool, and it's usually considered that monetary policy can be more easily implemented through monthly meetings or roughly monthly meetings. Fiscal policy is kind of harder to implement because of the underlying legislative lags, implementation lags, and so on. But given maybe the inefficacy of monetary policy, there is interest. There has been a lot of a shift towards fiscal policy measures, and lots of measures have been adopted since the crisis. So this have included, say, temporary tax cuts, like a tax cut, the VAT tax cut in the case of the UK for the whole of 2009, or even large public sector projects or infrastructure work. So that has kind of revived. Of course, the subject from a theoretical point of view is of fiscal policy is not necessarily new, and there have been earlier studies like Baxter King, Barrow King, and so on, which studied how temporary changes in government spending or permanent changes in government spending would impact on the economy in kind of neoclassical type models, but there have been because of this recent interest in fiscal policy. There have been kind of recently also lots of studies, like Bob Hall in the Brookings Papers of Economic Activity 2009, or even Mike himself recently in the American Economic Journal Macro has an article which surveys the literature. Our central focus has been the study of output multiplier effects, so meaning the effect of the change in, say, government spending on output. And you might think that obviously in traditional Keynesian models you could get like the Keynesian type multiplier, but which can be more than one. However, the interest is whether one can get similar kind of effects in more micro-founded models of the type which are probably more popular in recent times. And so these types of typically, one thinks of these types of fiscal measures as a temporary change in government spending. So the interest is in how a temporary change in government spending kind of impacts on output. And so the neoclassical or RBC kind of framework has been one of the frameworks which has been used. But of course, it is also kind of quite dismissed right away, even though it is kind of the benchmark model in say, Hall or even Mike. Is that the multiplier in the RBC type model is very small and well outside the range which is found in empirical studies. So typically, studies found multipliers which are in the range of 0.7 or to 1 These in this type of neoclassical model, typically find very small or implausible kind of, from an empirical point of view, multipliers. So one response might be to think of new Keynesian type models, and with rigidities and so on, which has been done, for example, in Mike's paper on Cristiano Eichenbaum, in Cristiano et al. in the JPE 2011. So, you might think, of course, in these types of models, the type of monetary policy response is quite important also in determining the effectiveness of fiscal policy. So if, with an active Taylor rule, if there is increase in government spending, which raises output, marginal costs, and expected inflation, and then if real interest rates rise, then there is a crowding out kind of output in consumption, and therefore the multipliers can be smaller, whereas with passive type rules or when the zero layer lower bound kind of binds, you might have much larger multipliers, in fact well above 1. So, so these are kind of results which are in the literature. What we take a kind of different angle, and we kind of go back to the basic kind of RBC type of framework or the model. And in this framework, we relax the rational expectations hypothesis. So this paper would be in kind of spirit or is in the framework which George kind of extensively analyzed in his lecture or yesterday. And so it's so here, generally it is considered that the rational expectations assumption is quite strong. Obviously, but it might arguably, it may be considered even stronger if one is looking at policy changes. And in a certain sense, agents might be required to know the structure of the economy both before and after the policy change. And so if you think of, they might, if there is a permanent change, you might have to jump from kind of one saddle path to another. And so they will have to coordinate, and this type of kind of coordination might be quite implausible, and to assume, and agents might kind of know that other agents are equal, knowledgeable, and rational. So our that adaptive learning approach, is generally that these are kind of too strong an assumption, and we kind of try to relax these assumptions in a certain way. So here you might think with policy changes are typically not necessarily unique. They may not have any policy change kind of might differ from another policy change in magnitude, durations, and various things. So so they may not know what the outcomes of a policy change are, and therefore may not know, say, the underlying kind of variables which might be interested in to them in forecasting the consumption and so on. So so they might try to gradually kind of improve the knowledge over time, and so that would be the spirit here. Of course, the implications of learning, as we know, and George analyzes, has been extensively analyzed in the past 10 years, notably kind of monetary policy design and so on. So that's I would, and I'm kind of citing more the papers which are kind of in the fiscal policy kind of related literature rather than the learning literature, because George already cited quite a few, a number of papers which are relevant and in the learning in this field, so our question here is. How does relaxing or introducing adaptive learning influence the magnitude of the multiplier? So that's one of the questions we ask in the standard real business cycle type of model, and partly because obviously it is a benchmark model, as I said, used in even these recent studies, and partly because the mechanisms are central in even more kind of other types of DSG type of models, you might say. So we have the basic framework with lump sum taxes. Again, this is the standard framework often used also in these studies for studying the effect of output multipliers, within the rational expectations kind of framework. Agents forecast wages and interest rates using a kind of statistical model, parameters being updated over time. So typically they would need to know like future wages, interest rates, and also future taxes. For taxes, kind of we assume that policy changes are kind of credible, and therefore it is known to the agents as a first approximation, and therefore this future path of taxes itself used by agents in their decisions making. So and this is has been used in our earlier paper in the JME, and you might think even in the monetary policy context, as George pointed out, UCP Preston have talked about whether you can think of issues like transparency of monetary policy depending on whether the interest rate rule is known or not. So this is in kind of a similar in spirit. So this much of structural knowledge is kind of given to the agents in this framework, but they still have to forecast kind of wages and interest rates which are relevant to the decisions and determined from general equilibrium considerations over time. So briefly, some of the results which we find are that for a temporary change in government spending, output multipliers are much higher under learning compared to RE. In fact, you might say even they fall within some of the ranges which have been found in the empirical studies. So the cumulative output multiplier, which I'll define kind of later on, can be even like around 0.993 kind of. We use obviously a kind of baseline calibration which has been used in the real business cycle kind of framework. Another is we kind of motivate obviously this through the recession and deep Great Recession and fiscal measures being adopted. So we also see and based on that we kind of see or try to examine whether the multipliers, fiscal policy can be effective also during such times of phenomenon. And obviously, the type in a real business cycle, this type of framework, the way to think of is through a series of negative shocks in technology, and this is what we do, and I'll explain later what exactly we do. But if you accept that kind of, one can see how effective fiscal policy is in this framework. Finally, as a kind of small thing, we also look at and we see that even this framework, there have been episodes of expansionary fiscal consolidations which have been, since the paper by Giavazzi Pagano in the 1990 has analyzing the fiscal consolidations in Ireland and Denmark in the 1980s, and how that led to, led to some non-Keynesian effects. So, cuts in public spending gave to boost to the economy. And we find that, adaptive learning can match certain features there, which kind of the standard rational expectations framework cannot. But, there are, of course, some caveats there, which maybe will be clear when I come to it. So the standard framework has been used, earlier, I think George kind of showed a similar framework. So the simple standard RBC framework with log preferences for consumption and leisure, and E hat is potentially subjective expectations for the future, and the households have the standard flow budget constraint, W wage, N is employment, R is the gross interest rate on loans, and the no arbitrage between interest rate and capital being the kind of the asset, and delta is the depreciation, tau is the lump sum taxes, and that's the standard kind of framework, and which the agent is confronted with, and so from here one can get the consumption-Euler equation and the first-order condition between consumption and leisure, and imposing the transversality condition, you can obtain the equation below, or an expected value kind of intertemporal budget constraint. Now, from there, if you linearize the expected value budget constraint and linearize the Euler equation around the initial steady-state values, you can obtain a consumption function where consumption is determined by future forecasts of wages, interest rates, and taxes. So those are defined below. So these are the SREs, SWEs, and the S tau E. So these are the present value type of expressions. So for as I said, that this consumption is determined by roughly, after-tax income, future forecasted after-tax income and interest rates. So an increase in expected wages might lead to a rise in consumption, and conversely for a rise in expected interest rates. So here, obviously, agents in this framework will require forecasts of interest rates, wages, and taxes. So as I said earlier, that in the case of taxes, we kind of give them some limited structural knowledge, and with the assumption of balanced budget, then it's the path of taxes or government spending is the same, and this is used by the agents in their decision making. However, the forecasts of interest rates and wages are done from a kind of VAR type model from the state of the economy, which is capital, and say the technology shock, and the coefficients will be updated over time as in the general kind of adaptive learning literature. Production function, is standard output Y with Cobb-Douglas, and V being the technology shock. So technology shock follows an autoregressive process with order 1, and V hat is the deviation from the mean of VT from the mean of this process, and the shock U tilde is kind of IID 0 mean normal variable with a certain variance, sigma square U. So then profit maximization implies the standard conditions for wages and rental rates. And in equilibrium, capital will evolve according to the final line. So capital, or that's the market clearing condition essentially. So capital tomorrow will be determined by the rest of the variables like consumption, government spending, and capital employment, and so on. So this is all kind of pretty standard. So here, just to remind you that without. Sorry.
You might have it just too fast. Is there a public debt?
No, there is none.
So what is government finance?
Just lump sum taxes by balanced budget. So, so without policy change, and under RE, the system can be written as follows. So capital and shock, the technology shock, is the state of the economy. So the capital tomorrow and shock tomorrow will be related to the past current KT and VT hat, and hat values is deviations from the deterministic steady state. So B is the matrix which governs this, and here other variables like consumption, wages, rental rates will also be just linear functions of these variables. So if you think so, in a sense, if you iterate this forward, kind of the future forecast of capital will depend on current capital and the shocks in the VT, and the dynamics under RE with the policy change has been kind of analyzed, is kind of standard, for example, in Jung-Sargent and so on. So what I said that our one of the motivations is to study kind of a temporary change in G, so surprise temporary change here. So we think of a simple policy experiment, so where the say government spending, there is a rise in G for a certain number of periods, and here say the example for 8 periods say, and then there is spending is then returns to the initial level thereafter. So it's like a 2-year increase in G. So sometimes people also think of this as a 2-year war or something. So then, so given that this path of G government spending is known to the agents, so they can compute the future forecast of taxes using this announcement, and for the remaining variables, as they need also the forecasts of wages and interest rates, they will use this econometric forecasting model, and motivated by the underlying kind of equilibrium without a policy change. And so capital, wages, and rental rates will be regressed on capital and the shock, and intercept terms allowed. And so these coefficients, the parameters, coefficients in the BK, AKKs, and so on, will be estimated on the basis of actual past data, and these will be updated over time. So given these coefficient estimates and the observed state, you can iterate forward to get the future capital and the shock, and that kind of gives rise to, and from there the wage and the rental rates or the interest rate forecasts, and these will be used in the consumption function thereafter. So all variables are in the steady state initially. So we use these values kind of which have been used in the in the RBC literature, and alpha 1/3 and betas, and V bar is is chosen the value V bar to approximately normalize output to be unity. One thing the updating rule used is kind of constant gain recursively squares, as it is called, and this is to, since there are structural changes, you might think that it is useful, or agents might want to use such type of gain, and so that they always give kind of some weight to recent data and more weight to recent data compared to older data. So we use a certain gain parameter which is 0.04, but typically with a smaller value of gain, the convergence is slower, and with very large values, typically they would be unstable. But the qualitative results are kind of quite robust for a range of the gain parameter. The policy exercise is an increase in G bar from 0.2 to 0.21 for a period, in this example, 8 periods, and we plot the mean time paths of these variables, of the various variables in the next figure. So we compare the variables under RE and learning for keywords, and these are measured in kind of percentage deviations from the steady state. So this is the figure for these various variables. So kind of important. So capital at the top, capital I, gross investment, then consumption on the second row, and employment. And the final row, output and the wage rate. And so that's, so under RE, the policy, the implications of this policy change are kind of well known. So there is a fall in capital during the time that the policy change is in operation, monetarily declining, and then there's a rise back to the initial steady state. And unlike a permanent change, like for a temporary change, the wealth effects are quite small, and this consumption smoothing within RE framework is adopted by a decreasing investment. And so investment is quite low under RE during this period. Consumption falls and employment rises on impact, and then there is a kind of rise towards the steady state eventually for these variables. So output as a result also rises under RE, but obviously thereafter it falls. And so the dynamics under and wages are low for the time of during the policy change. So these dynamics under RE are kind of known. So that is the dash, sorry, I didn't, it's written there. So the solid lines are the learning paths, and the dashed lines are the RE paths. Under learning, thing is that in the top kind of panel, as capital actually falls more than under RE, and there is a big fall in investment. And so under learning, actually, they lack the market clearing or the general equilibrium considerations, which to figure out that they don't realize, in a sense, that capital will fall in the future because of this rise in government spending, the crowding out effect, and that is what is reflected there. The impact effects, because the amount of consumption and employment are relatively smaller under learning in the beginning. However, what happens is that thereafter, capital is on a downward path and lower than RE levels. And since capital is on a downward path, there is wages forecasts, wage forecasts tend to be lower. Conversely, for the interest rate forecasts, which are not plotted in this here, interest rates and the forecasts which are not plotted here in this diagram. And then, obviously, there is, their consumption is on a downward path and employment on a rising path over time during the time the policy change is in effect. So there is a kind of gradual fall in consumption and a gradual rise in employment during the period of higher G. And that is reflected in the kind of the path of output, which, kind of, even though initially it's lower than RE levels, rises gradually to a much higher level. Again, once the policy comes off, the G, there is crowding in of capital, and that again is not anticipated by agents because they lack these, the relevant knowledge to work out the implications for capital. And therefore, after the change has come off, these effects are kind of reversed. So capital goes on a rising path. There is, rises quite substantially. Consumption goes on a rising path and employment on a falling path. But still, output tends to be, quite high compared to RE levels, even though it's declining. And that's, because of this rising path of capital, there is a big boost to investment under learning. And consumption also, in fact, goes above the steady state. So there is an overshooting of consumption and, boost to investment. And this leads to, output levels being higher under learning compared to RE levels. So,
question from an outsider. Is there any welfare reasons why the government should, policy needs the government?
This is the standard, the lump sum tax, change in G. There are from popular discussions that, it may be useful, but, there are, the standard reason for considering a change in G. And even if you may assume that, I guess utility is additively separable and in consumption government spending, and is useful in that sense. But it's no different from so that's it's analysis in the standard standard analysis. And I think Mike in your paper has works out some cases where G has.
Talking about a kind of policy where it was motivated by the crisis.
Well, it's probably stretching. I motivated more the interest in fiscal measures, or the interest in fiscal policy partly through that. Yeah, it is right. But this is the way it is typically done, and we stick to that framework. And our aim is really to compare kind of how adaptive learning might lead to different dynamics. Yeah, the motivation is we'll be looking at output multipliers and shortly in the next diagram, and how effective that these kinds of measures can be effective in the bigger rise in output.
Which may be even worse if the original equilibrium was up.
Sorry?
Which may be even worse than.
Which even worse than. So I guess it's so the increase in G. What is the impact on output, and that's what we are looking at. So you're saying that this may be even worse. Maybe I probably don't get your point right now. Maybe we can discuss it later. But so I have how many minutes left? A few minutes. Okay, so I'll just maybe in the next diagram I'll just quickly show you the multipliers. So the change in we plot the change in output over the change in government spending, and kind of a cumulative impact on output divided by the cumulative change in G. So and that is the left-hand side is kind of a distributed lag response, and the right-hand side is the cumulative response in output. And so as you can see that the impact on output is significantly higher under learning. So the cumulative effect can go up to 0.9 or 0.93 here, and whereas under RE it's only 0.2. And the reason is kind of what was in the earlier what was kind of illustrated in the earlier figure is that partly it is explained by the bigger investment response under learning. So there is a significant positive cumulative investment multiplier here, unlike the negative response under RE, and the consumption multiplier is less negative in a sense compared to RE, and that kind of explains basically why you have bigger effects on output from such a change in G. I guess since I don't have much, I will only have a few minutes, but it's just to say that we do kind of consider kind of something which was motivated by the events in the Great Recession, and we find that the stimuli, even if you have a kind of increase in G in this kind of during a type of situation where there's a Great Recession, you can have still bigger multipliers under learning compared to RE. And in the case of, I guess I'll not have time to, but to talk about the other case which I just mentioned, that there is some scope for matching some effects from fiscal consolidations when you have, say, a permanent surprise change in government spending in this framework. That cannot be done in the RE framework. So both the consumption and investment response can be replicated, but I think I'll stop there.
Wait, so what was the computed multiplier in your case?
So the cumulative multiplier is going up to 0.9 here under learning, and in the lower one under around 0.2. Yeah, 0.9, yeah.